Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful day of Flame Fatale 2022. I am Kungfufruitcup here, and I'm so excited to be speaking with you all to open up this event once again with another wonderful member of Malala Fund. Today, we are speaking with Jean-Ann NDow, who is the Girls Program Manager at Malala Fund. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm awake. I'm here. And it's great chatting with you. So I wanted to learn more about, obviously, your experience as a girls program manager. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means, how you would define that to someone?
Yeah, sure. So I joined Malala Fund in 2020, and I joined at a time where the fund launched a new strategic plan. And one of the key components of that strategy was the amplification of girls' voices and direct engagement with girls and young women. So historically, Malala Fund has been doing really incredible work to fund partners around the world that are supporting girls. But through this stream of work in the Girl Program, they really wanted us to start to find pathways through which we could directly engage with girls and young women. So in practice, what that means is that since 2020, I've built a fellowship program where we are now directly working with girls and young women in our program countries. We started awarding grants through our feminist girl funding, through our feminist grant making, and the majority of that funding has gone to girls and young women-led organizations. And then we've done lots of work around amplifying the voice of girls and young women and really thinking about how we can be intentional in bringing the voice and experiences of girls and young women into different spaces around the world, have them meet with decision makers, have them disrupt spaces where you don't traditionally find girls and young women. So yeah, it's varied. It's a really varied role, but really at the heart of it, it's about making sure that we are hearing from the girls who are most impacted by a lack of access to education.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a really wonderful thing, and it makes me think of a bunch of questions I'd love to ask.
Yeah.
So when it came to forming the fellowship, what would you say were some of the steps that you were putting in place for that, to get it working, to be able to connect with others, to move things forward?
Yeah. So we were building this fellowship at the height of the pandemic. And so we recognized the reality that these young women were probably not going to have the opportunity to meet face to face. So the digital kind of curation of spaces was something that was really important to think about. But then the other thing that was really important to me was this idea of how do we work with girls who don't traditionally have access to these opportunities. And often you find that when you see fellowship programs, a requirement is that you can speak English, especially for global programs and global fellowships. And so we were really kind of trying to work through this idea of language justice and thinking if we work in these different countries and these different contexts, and we want to support girls who are in the most marginalized communities, language justice has to be at the heart of what we do. And so we built a framework where many of the young women we're working with actually don't speak English. So we meet in groups where you have Portuguese speakers talking to Amharic speakers in Ethiopia, talking to Hindi speakers in India, talking to Urdu speakers in Pakistan, through lots and lots and lots of different interpreters. And it's been really incredible to build a space where language is actually not a barrier, which is what we were really hoping would be the case, but recognize that it can often be such a big obstacle. So there was lots of work around kind of just access to the sheer kind of technical devices, so laptops, phones, buying all of those things for the girls, making sure that it was as open and as accessible to as many different girls as possible, and then curating the space so that they could connect with each other. And then I think the other thing was just really thinking about what would be meaningful and valuable for these young women to learn about if they're coming into a space, recognizing just the diversity of their experiences. We have young women who are Indigenous Afro-Brazilians. We have young women who are survivors of sexual and gender-based violence who are living in communities and in safe houses. Where they are still seeking access to justice. We're working with young women in really conservative countries in some cases where child marriage is really prevalent. So all of the young women in the fellowship come from communities where there are lots of different barriers and challenges in accessing education. And what we wanted to do with the fellowship is provide them with as much space and opportunity to build their skill in advocacy and campaigning as possible. So really to give them the knowledge, the tools, the understanding of the root causes of why this inequality is happening, why gender inequality is happening, why there's a lack of access to education and violence. And then understanding, okay, with that knowledge, how do you take that knowledge and turn that into action? And so bringing in lots of really interesting partners to teach them photography and storytelling, to teach them about campaigning and how to build campaigns. It's been a really interesting journey and a really exciting journey to go on with all of the young women.
I love that. I love that. You're so prepared today. This is wonderful.
Yes.
So then it leads me to kind of my next question, which is, helping the girls like get access to all of these things and providing them with the tools they need. How would you say they've maybe best disrupted, or any specific stories or anything about like the girls disrupting these spaces around the world and being able to, push forward, push through a lot of this like adversity? What have you come to know about? And chat with
I would
about?
say it's really interesting because, again, often you find that for organizations, we don't often have the resources to be able to really engage girls from the most marginalized communities in the way that we've been able to do through the Girl program, because we were able to buy them laptops, because we were able to buy them phones, we were able to get them internet data. Like, there's a huge issue around the digital divide. I'm not even going to go into that. I'm sure you and your audience are aware of, but just the sheer lack of access to technology and to data to be able to engage in spaces, that was a really serious hurdle for us to tackle in order to make this a good program for girls. And so in being able to secure those devices for some of these young women, it was the first time they've ever had a computer in their house. Like, no one in their family had ever had access to a computer. So within the setting of their families, what we were learning was that their mothers, their siblings, everyone was now using this technology in order to do their own learning, to further their understanding of, different things that they needed access to in their communities, different challenges they were facing, and just to connect with people around the world. So that has been really positive. In other countries, we have young women, as I say, who are survivors of sexual violence. And this fellowship is the first time that they have had the opportunity to connect with girls around the world, to share their story of gender and sexual violence, to be able to tell their story, to be able to understand how similar their story is to so many girls around the world. I think that's one of the things that has struck me the most in facilitating this space with the young women, just how much similarity there is in the manifestation of violence and inequality against women and girls around the world, and really being in a space where they've been able to see that and hear that from each other, despite their hugely diverse contexts and experiences. It's been really enriching. I've cried a lot, I'll be honest. We've had sessions where I've just sat and cried because it just needed to happen. It was one of those sessions. But also it's been really fulfilling because there's been a huge amount of sisterhood and solidarity that we've been able to build between each other. A lot of trust has been built. And then in taking all of that experience and knowledge, these young women have then gone on to speak at really high level events, things at COP, the Climate Summit, things in different UN conferences, in spaces where they've been able to share the stories and the challenges of girls that they're experiencing, that they know, and the challenges that they've experienced. So I definitely think it started with the devices, but what we were able to do once we had access to those devices and the way we were able to curate that space has been really pivotal.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just creating that pathway again, like you were saying, it's so important to connect people from all kinds of different spaces, because you really never know how similar some of their experiences can be. Yeah. And like, I understand, especially like, being in this community online, we find all these things in common between speedrunning, between, doing this all women, our Frame Fatale community. It's a really wonderful space. And you do just realize how small the world can be in a lot of ways. Like, how much we all go through things together. It's so bonding, because we really need that. We really need that kind of connection. And so being able to provide that to girls is like such a wonderful thing. Like, it makes me feel emotional right now, but this is maybe not the space for that, even though like I'd want to talk about more in depth, like, tell me some of these stories. Like, I want to know what more of these people have been through, and how these girls are doing. And it's great. But for now, let's, I did have another question that you mentioned early on. You were saying something about there was feminist funding for getting some of these things together. Can you tell me a bit more about what that means?
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned, Malala Fund historically has been doing grant making. We've been awarding grants to partners around the world through the Education Champions program. And that has really focused on investing resources in individuals and in organizations, particularly the individual that comes from that organization, to support their work. When I joined the fund, as part of the Girl program portfolio, we wanted to try some new grant making, some new approaches to grant making. And there is a model of grant making called feminist funding. And when you talk about feminist funding, it's very similar in that you're giving resources, you're giving money to activists, to partners, but the way that you give them the money is very different. And so for the fund to shift and to evolve the way it was doing its grant making, the first thing we did was organize a learning series where we invited organizations who are doing really incredible feminist funding to come and teach us what it means to be a great feminist funder. So we heard from Purposeful, who are incredible. If you haven't heard of Purposeful, look up Purposeful. They're an amazing organization who are funding young women, very, very young women, to do really incredible work in their different program countries. We heard from the African Women Development Fund and from Marjorie, who work with frontline human rights defenders and grassroots communities. And a lot of the lessons that we were learning from them was really about how to shift power, how to be really intentional in our grant making, and how to become a trust-based funder. So the principles, I'll quickly run through just a few of the principles for you. Okay. And it wasn't just the donors, I'll mention, it wasn't just the funders. We also consulted with girls to understand from them, what do they need? How do they want us to show up in their communities and their countries as a donor? And what we learned was that first and foremost, that it has to be trust-based. So this idea of creating really complex systems where you have to report on really like specific, finite, how many numbers of people attended this event at this time, information that wasn't necessarily that useful in terms of understanding change and the way that change happens, and often was really difficult for the organizations to gather. It was data that was hard for them to gather because they don't have the infrastructure to go out and do all of this data gathering. So actually moving to a place where you trust your partner, you trust the organization you've given the resources to do the work that they've committed to doing. That was kind of a really key principle. Another is this idea of shifting resources into the hands of communities, and particularly in my case, shifting money into the hands of young women. Mm-hmm. And so being really intentional in having the resources available for young women to do the work they need to do well. What you often find with funding for young women-led activities, it's really small amounts of money. And so there is a limit in terms of how much they're able to do with those resources. Mm-hmm. So what we want to do is say, if we're giving you grants to say up to $100,000, how can you disrupt and shift your agenda quite significantly? And so we've been able to do that. And something else I'll mention is just the idea of really being really clear about what we mean by being women-led. So funding women-led and feminist organizations, working with partners who work at the intersection of a number of different issues. So organizations working on girls' rights and disability, working on trans rights, the experiences of trans girls in education, thinking about, I'm just thinking of all the different groups we funded, thinking of Indigenous groups, Indigenous young women who are doing incredible work on understanding the history of technology and the role of Black Indigenous women in production of knowledge and technology, like really interesting work. So thinking more strategically and partnering with organizations that are really at the forefront of those changes. In terms of feminist funding, there's lots more I could say about all of the different principles and the ways that it shows up. But I think the final thing I would say is just that the kind of money that you give is different in that it's not specifically tied to a project. So it's not that an organization applies for money to do this project and we are just funding that project. It's actually about funding the organization to run well. Right. So you give for core and flexible funding. And in core and flexible funding, what you're saying is if you need to use the money to hire staff, if you need to buy equipment, if you need to do some mental health support and well-being, like whatever it is you need to do to ensure that the work you're doing has an impact and is sustainable, that is the money that we're going to give you. We're not going to tie it to you doing a specific activity at a specific time and then wrap up the project once you've done that. And that has allowed for organizations to build approaches that are more sustainable and have longer term impact. So yeah, it's a fascinating area, and there's lots of really incredible work starting to happen in that space, but it's definitely a shift that the fund has now made, and it's something that we're committed to continue doing.
I love that. I love that. And it's really cool to see kind of how, again, since we've been working with Malala Fund for a couple of years now, it's really wonderful to see how things have been developing and growing and changing with you all. And it sounds like you are doing some really, really amazing work. Just giving more access to girls around the world. I mean, this is like, I feel like I have this conversation every time, which is so great. And I appreciate everything that you've been doing. It's wonderful to hear about all this. Again, I wish we had more time to go into more specifics. I want to be updated. I want to know like where I could find out about some things. I know we have the assembly with Malala Fund, so people can always check it out there at assembly.malala.org for stories. But we do need to get into the marathon. But I really appreciate you speaking with me today, Jean-Ann. It's been such a pleasure, and you've been so eloquent on letting me know all the details about what goes on with the girls program. It's so fascinating. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you everybody for tuning in today. Enjoy the marathon going on today. Please support. We have all kinds of wonderful incentives and things to look forward to, and we'll be speaking with more Malala Fund members throughout the week. And it's a really amazing fund. So yes, thank you again, Jean-Ann, and I will see you all soon.
Hello. Welcome back, everyone, to Flame Fatales 2022. I am Nicole Goodnight. I will be your host for this run. I just want to let you all know about a couple incentives we have coming up. We do have many to name some Pokemon. So if you have a name you want to get in there, go ahead and donate. Make sure you put that towards the incentive. The first one's going to be the Mudkips. So if you want to name those, go ahead and get that in. And actually, speaking of the run, we are all already set up for it. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Corvame and Sanjan with Pokemon Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire. It is an any% race for the DS. Take it away.